You know, it's kind of wild when you think about someone like J.K. Rowling, an icon for so many.
Yeah.
And then suddenly she's being called, like, transphobic and, well, even a Nazi simultaneously.
Right. It sounds completely contradictory.
Yeah,
Doesn't make sense on the surface.
exactly. And that kind of jarring puzzle, that's what we love getting into here on the deep dive.
Definitely. And for this dive, you, our listener, sent us something really interesting. It was a YouTube discussion
Yeah.
between our Reno and Winston Marshall. It focused on Reno's book, The Return of the Strong Gods.
Okay.
So our mission really is to cut through that conversation, pull out the key insights. We want to understand this idea of a post-war consensus,
Right.
something that formed way back decades ago, but apparently still has this, this unexpected grip on today's big debates.
Like populism, cultural clashes.
Yeah, populism, culture wars, even global politics. How does it all connect back?
That's the goal, isn't it? You want that shortcut to getting informed, seeing those surprising links that make things click without, like, drowning in information.
Exactly.
And Reno's argument, it seems packed with those connections. He's basically saying to get why figures like Rowling face these kinds of attacks,
You have to go back.
yeah, you got to journey back to the intellectual climate after World War II.
The core idea is this. After the absolute devastation between, say, 1914 and 1945, a powerful consensus, almost unspoken, took hold in the West.
Okay.
And the driving force was pretty simple. Never again. Just never let that happen again.
So a deep suspicion of intense ideologies.
Exactly. Especially things like nationalism, which was seen as, a major cause of the horror. The idea was to dial down the passion in public life, avoid those really fervent, unwavering beliefs.
The strong gods, as Reno calls them.
Precisely. And a key figure here, according to the source, was Karl Popper. His book, The Open Society and Its Enemies.
I've heard of that one.
Yeah, and it wasn't just a critique of dictatorships. Popper went way back, even targeted Plato,
Plato.
arguing that those ancient philosophies somehow laid the groundwork for these closed, authoritarian ways of thinking.
Huh.
And what's really interesting is Popper's argument that even the very idea of objective truth,
Like actual truth.
yeah, even that could become a dangerous, strong God, something that needed to be, well, pushed aside.
So what did he suggest instead?
He proposed focusing on meaning, something he saw as more fluid, something we construct ourselves, rather than a fixed, potentially divisive truth given from outside.
Okay, let's unpack this. So this shift
Right.
from objective truth to, like, subjective meaning, how did that actually play out? What did it do in the mid-20th century?
Well, think about it. If what's meaningful is basically up to each individual.
Then traditional authorities start to wobble.
Exactly. Things like religious doctrine, longstanding customs, they lose their automatic claim. And this fits, with the broader shifts happening then, questioning hierarchies, established beliefs.
Makes sense.
Reno also points to this Harvard committee, set up in 1943, to plan post-war education.
Okay, what was their aim?
Initially, they wanted a balance.
Mm.
The wisdom of the past, the great books, the canon alongside critical thinking.
But that balance tilted pretty significantly, didn't it?
It really did. The emphasis gradually, almost overwhelmingly, shifted towards questioning everything, challenging norms. And this, Reno argues, is where you see the roots of the canon wars later in universities.
Right, where the traditional curriculum got torn apart.
Yeah, that idea of a single authoritative tradition, that
Yeah.
strong God of inherited wisdom, it was increasingly rejected, all in the name of openness and critique.
Now, uses this term strong gods a lot. When he says that, what exactly are we talking about? Is it literal gods?
Not necessarily, no. Think of strong gods as the objects of our deepest loves and loyalties.
Okay, like what?
It could be your family, your country, your faith,
Yeah.
even deeply held principles. It's about those things that stir really profound emotions, command our allegiance.
So it's more about these fundamental drivers of how we act, how we feel.
Precisely. And importantly, Reno also points out that reason itself,
Reason.
reason, when it's searching for ultimate truth, can also act like a strong God. But then he contrasts these with what he calls gods of weakening.
Gods of weakening. What are those?
Things like extreme skepticism, where you believe nothing can really be known for sure. Or maybe a kind of overly therapeutic self-acceptance without any push for improvement or higher goals. And he also mentions the hearth gods.
Hearth gods, like home and comfort.
Yeah, basically the pursuit of health, wealth, pleasure, simple comforts, kind of a down-to-earth, maybe materialistic focus. These things, he argues, don't really inspire us or connect us to anything bigger.
Here's where it's really interesting. This whole framework Popper used, open societies versus closed societies, that seems absolutely central to this post-war consensus idea. Can you break that down a bit more?
Sure. Popper basically, drew a line in the sand.
Yeah.
On one side, open
The
societies.
good guys.
Yeah, he equated those with liberalism, freedom, democracy. That's the good side. On the other side, closed societies.
And those were...
That's where he lumped together fascism, totalitarianism, Nazism, but also nationalism and even religion.
Whoa, okay. Putting nationalism and religion in the same bucket as Nazism,
Yeah.
that's a strong claim. What was the thinking there?
Well, Reno really emphasizes Popper's personal background. He was an Austrian Jew, fled the Nazis.
Right, okay.
So his book was deeply personal. It was intellectual, but also an emotional reaction to the horrors he'd escaped. For him, these strong gods, especially fervent nationalism, rigid religious dogma, felt like the kind of powerful, unquestioned beliefs that fueled the irrationality and violence he'd seen.
So weakening them felt essential for never again.
Exactly. To prevent a repeat, it wasn't just abstract philosophy, it was shaped by trauma.
Makes sense.
And Reno connects Popper's work to a whole wave of influential books right after the war, all asking, basically, what went wrong.
Like,
Hayek's Road to Serfdom, Polanyi's Great Transformation, Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, From Plane's Escape from Freedom.
big names.
Yeah, all grappling with how the West could descend into such barbarity. Reno argues that whole period, 1914-1945, was like a collective trauma for the Western mind. As profound, maybe, as the wars of religion centuries earlier.
Leaving this deep-seated fear of anything that even smelled like those ideologies.
Precisely. An aversion to intense conviction.
And this connects right back to today, doesn't it? I mean, the rise of populism, nationalism in various places, it feels like a direct pushback against this whole consensus.
That's exactly Reno's point. He suggests a growing number of people, a plurality maybe, in the West, feel kind of constrained, almost imprisoned by this constant referencing of 20th century, the endless WWII comparisons.
Like always invoking Churchill for every conflict.
Yeah, like, is invoking Churchill always the right lens for understanding, say, Ukraine? They question if any deviation from these post-war norms immediately gets branded as, a step towards fascism.
It's like we're constantly warned that any strong collective identity is inherently suspect. Dangerous, even.
That's the argument Reno is exploring. He even floats the idea, quite provocative, that maybe it's time to move beyond the constant anti-Nazi framing, especially considering how much Germany and Britain have changed. He brings up Augustine's idea of a nation united by shared loves of res publica. And he asks, are things like the NHS in Britain truly enough to provide that deep, unifying bond?
Interesting comparison.
He contrasts that with America, which he sees as having maybe a shallower but very visible patriotism flags everywhere compared to maybe deeper but less overt national identities elsewhere.
And he shared that anecdote, didn't he, about the immigrant voting for Trump in 2016?
Yeah, the Jewish immigrant who said he wanted his kids to grow up in a country that was respected. That really highlights this yearning for, well, national strength and belonging.
It does.
Reno draws a line between a nation built on shared laws and just a commercial agreement managed by technocrats.
Implying we need something more than just rules.
Right. And he argues that the constant anti-rhetoric from elites, anti-Nazi, anti-racist, can actually be a tool to maintain that old consensus, to shut down dissent. He even mentions Tony Blair as a key figure promoting this consensus and his immigration policies in the UK.
Now, when we talk about nationalism, you often hear this split. Civic versus ethno-nationalism. How does Reno handle that?
He uses Hans Kohns' distinction, which is pretty standard. Civic nationalism is more about shared territory, political loyalty.
Right.
Whereas ethno-nationalism puts more weight on shared culture, ethnicity, maybe a deeper metaphysical connection.
Then which one fits where?
Reno suggests it varies. Ethno-nationalism might resonate more in a place like Finland, relatively homogenous. Civic nationalism seems a better fit for somewhere like the U.S., with its history of immigration.
But even in civic nations, he thinks there's still a need for shared culture, shared stories, right? It's not just laws.
Absolutely. He argues those deeper cultural ties, the shared myths and narratives, are actually more fundamental for unity than just shared ethnicity.
Which then raises questions about mass migration.
Exactly. It brings up the challenge. How do you maintain a strong shared culture with large-scale immigration? A big debate in Britain, obviously.
But he also talks about integration, doesn't he?
He does. He brings up this idea of a meta-ethnos, or a kind of overarching meta-culture
Yeah.
that can unify a diverse place like America. He points to how quickly kids of immigrants often dive right into American pop culture, for example.
So it's a really tricky balance. Acknowledging integration happens, but also the real concerns about immigration levels, open borders.
Right. Reno critiques the tendency to just automatically say mass migration is great, diversity is our greatest strength,
Hmm.
without grappling with the real challenges it poses, the need for management.
He thinks unity is more important.
He argues unity, built on trust and what he calls civic friendship, is ultimately a greater strength than diversity alone, especially for democracy. You need to trust the other side, basically.
And he connects the polarization in the U.S. to a breakdown of that trust.
Yeah, a sense that the other side doesn't even want what's best for the country anymore.
And attacks on, say, constitutional norms are really attacks on these open society norms.
That's his point.
Okay.
He uses Trump's wall proposal as an example, a relatively concrete policy, but it gets immediately framed as practically fascist
Why?
because it challenges a core tenet of the open society consensus. The ideal of openness, including open borders, any perceived threat triggers this extreme reaction, linking back to those accusations against someone like Rowling.
So is Reno basically saying this whole open society consensus is starting to fray, losing its grip on how we think?
That's his core argument, yeah.
Yeah.
He thinks its power to shape our collective imagination is weakening. He talks about metaphysical dreams, these underlying beliefs that shape a society.
Okay.
And he suggests we're seeing a contest now between the open society dream, where diversity is the ultimate good, and these emerging alternative visions may be focused more on national identity, belonging.
And he connects things like transgender ideology and border control.
He uses them as illustrations of underlying beliefs about boundaries. If the traditional boundaries between male and female are seen as fluid or questionable,
Then maybe national boundaries are too.
that's the connection he draws. It reflects a deeper philosophical stance on whether boundaries are good or inherently limiting.
It's fascinating how he links these seemingly separate issues, cultural debates, political ones.
It really is. And he reminds us why nationalism got such a bad rap in Europe after WWII. It was seen as the cause of the war,
Unlike in the U.S.
right, where nationalism was part of defeating the Nazis. A very different experience. Reno also points fingers at universities, liberal professors, for actively promoting anti-nationalism.
To the point of removing classic texts.
Yeah, even taking things like Virgil's Aeneid out of Western civ courses because it was seen as glorifying empire or something.
Wow. This raises an important question then. If this consensus is weakening, what does the return of these strong gods actually mean? What are the dangers we should be looking out for?
Well, Reno is careful to acknowledge the honorable intentions behind Never Again. Very noble impulse.
Sure.
But he argues the pendulum might have swung too far. And maybe the biggest fear now isn't a return to 1930s ideologies, but something else,
Like what?
like societal and even personal disintegration. You see it in the mental health crisis, maybe a lack of purpose, a kind of general malaise. He brings in this Eastern Christian idea of acedia, kind of a heartlessness, a dispiritedness. He thinks that might be more relevant today than, say, excessive pride.
So the purely negative, never again focus might actually be contributing to this feeling of emptiness.
That's his suggestion, yeah, that the constant focus on avoiding past evils might lead to overreach. He mentions pandemic lockdowns as a possible example.
Okay.
He argues that love, even with the risks involved, because strong loyalties can go wrong, is essential for a healthy society. He contrasts this with Popper's more cautious view of strong emotions.
And he connects things like wokeism, environmentalism.
Yeah, even aspects of the trans movement to a basic human need for meaning, for loyalty, especially after the perceived, death of God or weakening of traditional religion,
A search for new strong gods.
potentially. And he warns about iconoclasm, the urge to tear down old symbols if it ends up destroying things that are beautiful or attract our loyalty.
That makes sense.
He even suggests woke ideology can sometimes act as a kind of enforcer, a janissary for the open society consensus, policing its norms. And he brings up George Soros,
Oh, yeah.
discussing Soros's deep belief in Popper's ideas and his funding of projects aligned with that open society vision, seeing Popper's framework as this grand explanation for everything.
The Lord of the explanations.
Right. But Reno warns against that kind of oversimplification. He argues our current moment is way more complex historical trauma, lots of factors, not just one philosopher's fault.
What about the populist backlash itself? Does he have specific worries there?
Yeah, one thing he mentions is a potential for a kind of Um, Disordered obsession with heroic manliness, often displayed anonymously online. Aggressive posturing.
Okay.
He stresses the need for restoring genuine heroism for both men and women in different forms, like the courage involved in raising children or in defending your community or country, real-world stuff.
And Popper's tolerance paradox, how does that fit in?
He critiques how that idea that being infinitely tolerant lets intolerance win can be misused.
How so?
It can be twisted to suppress traditional views by labeling them hate speech, leading to things like hate speech laws or those non-crime hate incidents in the UK.
So he sees liberalism as useful, but maybe as a modifier, something that softens other loyalties.
Exactly. Liberalism works best as an adjective, he suggests, tempering more fundamental loves. Because love itself, or loyalty, isn't inherently liberal. It's deeper.
And how did post-war conservatives interact with Popper?
He mentions figures like Hayek, Buckley. They were influenced by Popper but tried to add ballast to the open society idea,
Ballast.
like religion, moral tradition, trying to ground it. This led towards neoconservatism, magazines like First Things.
Was neoconservative democracy promotion abroad a direct result of Popper then?
Reno argues not directly. It wasn't just Popper. It was more about trying to provide that missing moral foundation on a global stage. He even points to someone like Jefferson, a deist, sure, but still appealing to God and a moral order, shows that deeper need.
What about religion itself? There seems to be a bit of a resurgence, or at least more talk about it. Ion Herseyali's conversion, for example.
Reno definitely sees that. He links this renewed interest, particularly in Christianity, to the populist movement, a search for stability, for something solid in this very fluid, uncertain world, what he calls it the liquid world.
Is it just vague spirituality, though?
He makes a distinction. He contrasts soft religion, spiritual but not religious, with what he thinks might be coming. A return to hard religion.
Hard religion, meaning?
Doctrines, rituals, clear moral frameworks, structure. He quotes Nick Cave saying religion is spirituality with rigor. He predicts we'll see a renewal of faith, family, flag in the next decade or so.
Okay, finally, let's bring it back to Trump. How does Reno read his rise through this whole lens of rejecting the consensus?
He basically paints Trump as this kind of unreconstructed baby boomer patriot,
Ying.
less shaped by that post-war consensus caution, maybe. But beyond the personality, Reno argues his election showed a real public hunger for protection, for security, in a society feeling under assault.
He contrasts Trump's message with others.
Yeah, he contrasts Ted Cruz's 2016 convention speech, lots of focus on freedom, with Trump's speech, which was heavy on protection, walls, tariffs.
A different emphasis.
A very different emphasis. Reno sees this as signaling a shift in priorities for a big chunk of the electorate. He uses the term reconsolidation.
Reconsolidation, as in rebuilding.
Yeah, as a counter-movement to the deconsolidating effects of the open society consensus. A desire to rebuild national identity, shared values, maybe even physical borders.
But he adds a warning note too, right? Reconsolidation could go too far.
Absolutely. He's not blindly cheering it on. His point is more about engaging with this populist energy, trying to guide it constructively, rather than just condemning it from the sidelines.
He brings up Ordo Amoris.
Right, the idea of a proper ordering of loves. Contrasting it with the open society, which he sees as maybe lagging that clear hierarchy of loyalties. He uses a sports team analogy. You love your team, but you know it's not the most important thing in the universe. Proper perspective.
Does unity require enemies, like Carl Schmitt argued?
Reno pushes back on that. While acknowledging Schmitt, he argues shared loves are a better foundation for unity than shared enemies.
And the word nationalism itself?
He points out how negative its definition often is, even in dictionaries. But he argues it's important right now, as a kind of necessary re-emphasis on national interest, shared identity, maybe shared myths.
But maybe the term itself will fade if those ideas become mainstream.
That's his suggestion. If populist ideas become the governing consensus, maybe you won't need the explicit label nationalism as much.
And how does censorship fit into this picture? Modern cancel culture, online mobs.
Reno connects it back to that never-again mentality via Gordon Allport's pyramid theory.
The idea that mean words lead inevitably to.
Yeah, that hurt words are on a continuum directly leading to things like the Holocaust. It fits the never-again framework perfectly.
But he sees a danger there.
A huge danger.
Yeah.
That never again can become almost totalitarian if it tries to eliminate the possibility of evil by eliminating essential parts of being human. including certain beliefs or expressions.
He mentions those authoritarian personality studies, too.
Right, from Adorno and others after the war, linking traditional views or strong beliefs directly to proto-fascism. He gives that shocking example of a toddler apparently suspended for being transphobic
Right.
as an illustration of how far this can go. But he thinks the populist surge is actually starting to discredit the overuse of the fascist label. People are tuning it out.
What about things like lawfare? Using the legal system against opponents?
He sees that potentially as the death throes of the old consensus, trying to maintain control by any means, even if it looks like suspending democracy to save democracy.
Is he pessimistic about democracy surviving?
Cautiously optimistic, actually, especially about the U.S. system's resilience despite the pressures. He also sees Trump's challenge to the rules-based international order.
Which is like the open society gone global.
Exactly. He sees that challenge as needed, arguing the order was already failing anyway. Look at Crimea happening before Trump. He hopes this might spur national revitalization in Europe, too.
But there are risks.
Oh, definitely. The danger that adversaries might exploit the West's internal shifts while it's recalibrating.
Finally, he touches briefly on non-Western countries, right? They're strong gods.
Yeah, he notes the apparent success, economically at least, of places like India, where you see rising Hindu nationalism. Strong gods seem to be working there in some ways.
What about China?
He acknowledges their economic power, of course, but suggests they might be hobbled long-term by communism itself, a Western ideology, and its materialist view. He contrasts the CCP's technocratic style with traditional Confucianism's focus on virtue.
He sees Marxism as Western.
There's a kind of secularized Christian eschatology, yeah. A Western idea transplanted. He ends by reflecting on the old American confidence in being able to mix modernity and religion, admitting there's more uncertainty about that now.
Wow. Okay, so to really try and boil this down, this deep dive suggests that the whole way the West thought after WWII, this post-war consensus driven by Never Again and thinkers like Popper, it's had this massive, often unseen impact on everything we argue about today.
Absolutely.
And the very idea of what counts as a good or bad, strong God, loyalty, faith, nation has been totally contested. Now it seems we're in a major shift, a kind of pushback or reconsolidation.
Yeah, reevaluation with all the potential upsides and downsides that come with such a big change.
Exactly. Reno acknowledges the risks, the complexities, but there's also this undercurrent of maybe cautious hope, a sense that maybe deeper meanings, national confidence could be rediscovered.
That's the feeling, yeah.
Ah.
A belief in resilience.
So we'll leave you, our listener, with a final thought to chew on. It seems clear the West's historical trauma shaped our present in profound ways. Understanding that might help us navigate what comes next, maybe moving beyond the shadow of that immediate post-war moment. So consider this. What strong gods do you see making a comeback in the world around you? And how could we maybe guide that energy constructively?
A lot to think about there.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.